Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Features here. Yeah. Well, actually,
Oh, okay. Well, it's, so glad to have you guys on board.
We should be.
It's wonderful. Well, that is what I can say.
The lack of tie and the presence of spirit. Let's see.
You saw your name in the instant?
Yeah. Network for the future.
Sure.
Very lofty name to aspire to.
Yeah. It's good. Those are good.
Yeah, I'm really excited that it's developed.
They borrow you for one.
Oh, sure.
So, Peter,
Okay.
Like you just mark over, kind of awkward water drink.
put it right here.
That's nearly invisible.
On purpose.
No, that's all right. I'll just keep that on.
Okay.
I should take this. Three past. Do you want to do it here?
Yeah, we might have a minute or two. I defer to your expertise.
Yeah, it's like 5 minutes. I went to his happy hour and then we just timed it really poorly where my friend and I were going to visit jazz workshop, so I just yeah, I'll see you again soon. Like he like messages me like weird questions like once he was like, hey, how do you negotiate a salary? I'm like, what, he asked me the weird.
That's not good advice.
I was just like, it's like you're Joseph King. No, back there. What's the cost of it? It's cheaper to do this. Like, this is so expensive.
Hello, everyone. We're going to start in just a moment. Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Sinkin, and welcome to the Daniel Morgan Graduate School. I'm Vice President for External Affairs, and I have the honor of welcoming a former colleague and past and present friend of mine, Jim Schoff, who's had a distinguished career, first of all at the Pentagon in the Obama administration, where he worked on East Asian issues at a senior level. And previous to that, at the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis, a small but punching above its weight think tank where I also cut my teeth these many years. And Jim worked there and did a lot of consulting work with people in government of a sensitive nature that I can't go into too much, I guess. But right now he's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Institute, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And we're very honored to have him here. As you know, or some of you know, Carnegie and the Daniel Morgan Graduate School have been collaborating on a project that is looking at trilateral cooperation, present and potential among the U.S., Japan, and the Republic of Korea on security issues. And I wish that I could say the prognosis was good, but it is clear, unfortunately, that the Japanese-Korean relationship now is sort of, I guess, it would be no secret to say, the weak leg of the triad at the moment, and how to shore it up in a way that's healthy and productive for all parties. It's a real question. So I think that this report that Schoff will be giving us is extremely timely and important. With no more introduction than I think was necessary just to tee you up, Jim, let me hand over to you and welcome you and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate that, and I'm grateful for the invitation, the opportunity to be here today to Daniel Morgan Graduate School, but of course also for our collaboration on this project. It was really the two of us sitting together and thinking about what were some of the more important priorities for U.S. security interests in East Asia going forward. I can move this. Thinking about U.S. security interests in the region, and one of the most important areas is this area of trilateral cooperation, dealing with the North Korean challenge, also keeping our eye on the future of our relationship and balancing competition with China as well, but how to reinvigorate or reconstitute U.S., Japan, and South Korea trilateral security cooperation in the current environment. And so part of what I want to talk about today is a little bit about the recent past history of trilateralism in East Asia and what's been going on, some of the dialogue that went on in our workshop in Tokyo in January. So there's a report out front, you're welcome to grab, that just came out today. I've been working on it with Paul Lee, who's a junior fellow at Carnegie. And this project, just introduced quickly, is a Track 1.5 workshop dialogue series. The first was in Tokyo, the next will be here in Washington later this year. We'll do another one in Seoul after that. And we have partners in Japan, the Japan Institute for International Affairs, and in Korea, the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, Daniel Morgan Graduate School, and Carnegie. So the four of us together have put this forward. And there's it's an interesting, just doing the event itself is an interesting microcosm of the challenges of managing trilateral security cooperation. But I think there is a good spirit and a deep seated reasons or rationale for trilateralism that continues today that gives me some hope going forward. But there's a lot of options and a lot of questions about which way to go. So that's part of what we'll talk about today. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the background of trilateral security cooperation. And I'll focus primarily on the security piece, but there's obviously a heavy diplomatic and economic component to our relationship. And when I was at the Pentagon, I had the good fortune of essentially being the Sherpa or the lead Sherpa for the Defense Trilateral Talks that were going on between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. And some of my experiences there will be reflected in here. And when I was at IFPA before that, we did a whole project on tools for trilateralism. There's a book that I wrote on that subject, which looked at the evolution of trilateral cooperation, which you would think with two of America's oldest and strongest allies in East Asia, we would maybe already be there by the time we got to the 1990s, but we weren't necessarily, and I think that was in part due to the structural differences in the U.S. alliance relationships with Japan and with Korea. We had a combined forces command with Korea, very integrated relationship in Korea, very heavily focused just on the peninsula. Our forces, U.S. forces in Korea, did not deploy all over the region and such. With Japan, we had a parallel command structure, very different legal restrictions on what Japan could do anyway, security-wise in the region. Of course, the historical animosity and the legacy of Japan's colonial rule over Korea from 1910 to 1945 made any kind of security cooperation with Japan very politically sensitive in Korea, and there was really no need for it anyway during the Cold War. It was really not until the 1990s and North Korea's development of a nuclear program, a missile program, that really began to put this into form. And that started with kind of ad hoc coordination meetings among the three countries, primarily focused on negotiations or diplomacy at the UN with the IAEA vis-a-vis North Korea. They eventually launched the TCOG, or the Trilateral Coordination and Oversight Group, in the late 90s. And this was a very formalized, they numbered each meeting, this is the 7th meeting of the TCOG group, to coordinate their policies vis-a-vis North Korea. Not so much necessarily to proactively steer certain outcomes. I think it was more to avoid conflicts of policy and approaches and making sure kind of no harm came out of their various efforts to navigate the boxing in or the controlling of North Korea's program. That eventually became, after 2004 with the Bush administration, a little bit less formal, but it was still actively going on. It was not until '98 that you see the Defense Trilateral Talks be started. Not coincidentally, it was more on purpose as a result of, right around this time, you had the real concern about a potential conflict with North Korea. Came out of the '94 kind of scare that we would potentially have some military action, and we realized that Japan was woefully unprepared to support the United States in any conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And so we engaged in a long negotiation with and discussion with the Japanese to revise our defense guidelines, and they actually created new laws, the situations in areas surrounding Japan, or the SIAS-J law, to allow Japan to provide logistical support to the United States if there was some kind of war or conflict on Korea. So the defense component of U.S. Korea and U.S. Japan cooperation all of a sudden had a more important or immediate trilateral connection. And the DTTs, or the Defense Trilateral Talks, were a way to help kind of broker that dialogue and that understanding. The J5 strategy talks were another element of that, where the policy shops of the joint staffs of each country would get together and talk about, less from a policy perspective, a little bit more operationally. Maybe there were some exercises and things they could do to practice and get better, and that was introduced. And then later, the Tri-Chad was the chiefs and heads of defense. would get together, and you'd have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and counterparts in Japan and Korea, talking by video teleconference to begin coordinating some of this. And this all kind of organically emerged over the course of the 90s, stopped for a while in the in 03, because of Japan-Korea arguments over textbooks and other types of things. But as the North Korean threat increased later in the 2000s, we had a chance to resume this. And I was fortunate enough when I was at the Pentagon to be able to be there at almost the perfect time for trilateral cooperation, 2010, 11, 12, when you had North Korea attacking South Korea ship, the Cheonan, sinking, Yonggwang-do attacks, heavy pressure, reminiscent of some of the earlier military actions that North Korea had taken against South Korea in the late 90s. So and very little support from China in this regard. China was almost kind of defending North Korea when South Korea was complaining about these various things. But Japan and the DPJ at the time, the Democratic Party of Japan, was very vocally supportive of South Korea. And you had Lee Myung-bak and the government, the more conservative government in Korea that was very willing or more receptive to the idea of alliance cooperation, trilateral cooperation to help deter North Korea and provide a united front. So I'll go to some of the details of what we were able to accomplish at that time. So I had, when I pulled up this old presentation that I had put together actually in 2012, was the last time I gave this most formal talk. It stopped after the established question mark area. We had to add this later whole section on withering and whether or not trilateral security cooperation has essentially peaked, or whether we have an opportunity to move forward. Because we got all the way to a point of, in 2014, 2016, after, in 2012, we had a real break between Japan and Korea on this agreement of sharing classified information and military information. We thought they were going to sign essentially a GSOMIA at the time. That fell apart, but we managed to put that back together, especially leading into 2016, 2017 with ramping up North Korean nuclear missile program and intimidation. And Japan and Korea actually did sign a formal GSOMIA, essentially a security agreement on handling military information. And we had the trilateral information sharing agreement that preceded that in 2014. But in 2017, as time went on, we had the Moon government come in, very divergent views on how military pressure can and should be applied to North Korea. We also had, even though we had military, quasi-trilateral military exercises at the time, the South Koreans did not want to link U.S. Japan, for example, flights of bomber aircraft that would come up toward, from Guam and up toward North Korea. They did not want those specifically to be trilateral exercises, so we crafted them in a way that they were U.S.-Japan exercises, and there was kind of a baton pass, and then they became U.S.-Korea exercises, and not formally trilateral exercises. You have Moon's promise to Xi Jinping, in a sense, to say there will be no trilateral alliance, there will be no trilateral missile defense architecture or regime in the region. Then, of course, late last year, more significantly, this radar lock-on incident between the South Korean Navy and Japanese intelligence air surveillance aircraft. You had the whole argument with whether a Japanese ship, MSTF ship, could show its rising sun service flag during one of the fleet reviews that were going on in South Korea. These were all in a backdrop of deeper political disruption in the Japan-Korea relationship, which we'll go into in a little bit later. And now real questions about whether this escalating dispute on the forced labor issue and interpretation of the 1965 normalization treaty between Japan and Korea, whether that's going to get much worse this year. So we're really in a tough spot currently. I would say, reflecting on the 2010-2011 time, 12, when things were good, that the personal relationships made a big difference. The relationships between the Blue House, of course, and the Prime Minister's office, between the foreign ministries and the defense ministries in particular, and the people that I worked with, I think there was really a shared sense of purpose, that trilateralism was not easy, that it was always logistically complicated and hard. Doing things bilaterally are much easier. We were trying to schedule observations, Japanese observations of U.S. South Korea military exercises and vice versa. It makes things in some ways unnecessarily complicated. What can you show them? What can you not? Where can they go? Just scheduling a trilateral meeting becomes exponentially more complicated to coordinate schedules. But there was a sense almost of historic purpose, I think, among the group that we were moving towards a whole new plateau or a whole new level of collaboration that could really benefit all the countries. Now, I want to quickly revisit this issue of why trilateralism. What is the whole goal and reason for doing this? On the kind of short-term surface view, in some ways it's just there to kind of demonstrate or try to puff ourselves up vis-a-vis North Korea, make sure you don't mess with us because we're prepared to deal with any kind of conflict on the Korean Peninsula. Sometimes it's a little bit of a warning or a gesture to China to get North Korea under control, because if you don't, you're going to essentially feed this growing alliance coordination, and you'll have a NATO of Asia, which you certainly don't want, and it'll all be because you didn't sufficiently control North Korea. But I think it's broader than that and deeper than that, and it gets to this issue of course, our common interests on deterrence, but our common values are a very important part of it. Democratic values, human rights, economic values, and the like. I just want to get my... It directly supports and has supported our national security strategy for some time, and if you look at Japan's as well, it's clearly a part of contributing to regional stability and openness, an effort to try to create something that is not just against North Korea, but that it actually stands for something. There's some rhetoric to that, but I think there's some real truth to that. Trilateralism is not exclusive. It's open door, in a sense, at least in theory. China's always welcome to participate in various things that we do, and Japan, U.S., Australia trilateralism has emerged and then added an Indian component to it, and there have been opportunities to, whether it's missile defense, to do things in a U.S., Japan, Australia, Korea context, or if it's in some other area, for example, counterproliferation. The U.S., Japan, and South Korea are usually the largest contributors of assets for the Proliferation Security Initiative, for example. And currently, what's going on, the sanctions enforcement effort vis-a-vis North Korea right now is being hosted by Japan in East China Sea, Sea of Japan. South Korea participates in that. Of course, other countries do too, Australia, France, the UK as well. So there's an open door element, but the fact is, Japan and Korea are the countries that the United States has the most training opportunities with, the most force presence in close proximity, the most interoperable services, especially on the maritime side, but also on the air side. So there's just great, if we're going to take advantage of each other's resources, assets, it's easier, cheaper, better for all three of us in the security realm to collaborate and really be a kind of a core group function. Now, in some cases, this can be for humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, or it could be for other kind of non-hard military, more or less traditional military areas of cooperation. And we saw it expanding as North Korea expanded its submarine capability, for example. Then anti-submarine warfare collaboration became a part of the U.S. Japan, South Korea trilateral component. I think there's this idea too of preparing for the future, not knowing exactly what the regional order is going to be, but the idea that if we can help lead by example and provide stability in the region, that is something that will attract other countries to be partners in this effort. And if we're doing everything kind of separately, that argument is weaker. Of course, the obstacles are not only the historical issues between Japan and Korea, some of them are also territorial. If you look at polling results in South Korea and in Japan in terms of asking about each other, there are the territorial issues actually rise quite significantly. So there's the Takashima-Dokdo disagreement, but also some disagreements over fisheries areas, and there have been efforts in the past to kind of demark that. Enduring stereotypes of each other in these polling results, zero-sum economic thinking in some regards in terms of the economic competition. So the challenge is quite considerable. I want to give you a feel for where trilateral security cooperation was in around the 2011-2012 time. So this was essentially a schedule that we had internally looking at trilateral security cooperation. And this was in parallel to the State Department, Foreign Ministry, et cetera, had their trilateral dialogues, and we're trying to look at some broader issues. But we basically had it in a pyramid structure of this is the ministerial level, these are the DTTs, or essentially the policy, defense policy level. This is the J5 kind of military, mil-to-mil relationship level, and in some cases there were service-to-service trilaterals, so you had a Navy trilateral or an Army trilateral, Air Force as well. And this is the think tank realm, so the track 2 arena. And over the course of a year, we tried to, and I think succeeded, essentially to have set as a regular meeting of the defense ministers when they were at the Shangri-La conference in Singapore each year. And the idea, we always fought back on the efforts to have bilaterals. So the Japan side was like, okay, well, we'll do the trilateral, but we also want a bilateral. And then the Koreans would want a bilateral. And meanwhile, this was the one opportunity for the defense secretary to meet with a broad range of ASEAN state members and counterparts. So we tried, we have our 2+2, we have our SCM with our partners, we have other opportunities to do the high-level engagement bilaterally. Let's try to make the Shangri-La be, for us, the trilateral component. And I think eventually that has become quite regular. And it's important because it sets the tone and kind of in some ways, our fiscal year for trilateralism started in June. And these are the things, these are the objectives we want to do. And then from that, the DTT working group meeting would happen soon thereafter. So we go, okay, so our bosses now have set this as the priority. These are the things we want to work on. The J5 strategy talks would also build off of that as a way to design then what's our exercise schedule going to look like going forward. How do we support the commander's intent there? And we started building out other components. So the HADR, Humanitarian Assistance Disaster Relief Tiger Team we created was a trilateral kind of rapid reaction team that was a subset of the DTTs, and they were going to look into ways to speed up information sharing and complementary deployments of assets in case there's a massive hurricane or tsunami or earthquake somewhere in the region. And part of the rationale was this would help demonstrate, number one, it's a more efficient use of our assets, rather than all three individually trying to figure out what's going on the ground, what needs to be sent, etc. But it also would help demonstrate the value of trilateral cooperation to our respective publics. And people would come to say, oh yeah, well the U.S., Japan, South Korea, they always cooperate together and help out people. And that's a good thing. So we had this HADR Tiger team. There was beginning to be a counter weapons of mass destruction working group as well, was another subcomponent. You could imagine various little subcommittees or working groups coming out of the DTTs that would tackle various priorities that we could work on. These were some of the trilat exercises that would take place. This was the Multilateral Information Assurance Workshop. So as we were trying to put an information sharing agreement into place, the idea was, okay, how does each side secure information, and let's get a better handle on that and what things need to be improved. So, and then this was the pretty robust track 2 agenda that was going on at the time. But if you look at where we are now, and I don't have access to the Defense Department's real schedule, but this is essentially kind of, as I understand it, where we're at now. It's a much thinner schedule. I think we will continue to have our trilateral Shangri-La, and that's something to look for coming up. The DTTs are still happening. I think they only do maybe one working group a year instead of 2. I haven't seen any evidence of the subcommittees or other working groups continuing. When Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines, for example, there was no trilateral response a few years back, where that would have been the perfect opportunity to leverage that Tiger team in that sense. But these dialogues are continuing. The Tri-Chad has taken place. I think there will be at least one trilateral exercise this year. I expect it to be probably missile defense oriented. They have continued the Pacific Dragon exercise out near Hawaii because that's the best range to use, and it's still a priority in all 3 countries. You just won't read much about it. It'll be kind of under the radar. And to my mind, the only now continuous trilateral track 2 effort is the one that we have launched recently going on now. There's still some ad hoc things here and there, but it's a little bit, well, it's thin in this regard, I guess is the best way to make it. So overall, I think what we've always tried to encourage with our colleagues is that for whatever problems there are in the Japan-Korea diplomatic relationship, the trilateral is a safe haven. You don't have to justify your participation in a trilateral event to your publics as, well, this is somehow a diplomatic gift to the other side that is snubbing us on one issue or another. Trilateral is trilateral. It's totally different. It's in all of our national securities. And this is a safe haven for collaboration. And of course, within that provides a forum for Japan-Korea interaction on issues like how many nautical miles you can get within or 100 meters you can get within a ship when you're trying to see what's going on the ground, or if there are disagreements or misunderstandings between the Japanese and Korean militaries. This is an opportunity to kind of sort that out in a place that doesn't put the spotlight on the Japan-Korea component per se. So I think we've maintained, at least to some extent, that idea of a safe haven. But there are some structural issues that we're working against. Not only the Japan-Korea challenges, but the trilateral initiative itself always had certain weaknesses in it. One is this frequent turnover of people. So you were constantly, the people who were in charge of managing the trilateral piece, and even up to higher levels, were constantly changing jobs, and then you'd have to kind of reorient a whole new group of people. And so, what is this I'm now in charge of? What have you been doing? Why are we doing this? And there's often an effort to try to demonstrate something. So when you have all these regular meetings, like we had, I mean, to some extent, this is great, it looks great on a chart, and some of it was very good, but some of it was not sustained. A lot of it was not sustained on the working groups, for example. And those are things that are naturally come out as, okay, well, we need to do something. We need to deliver something. What's going to be the new thing that we're going to do? So rather than get better at one thing that you've been doing, or more sophisticated, more resources invested in a particular activity, it was usually, let's throw up this new idea and do something new. And so few things got the kind of traction that in some cases I think they deserve. There are some potentially, so overall the system in my mind, or the way it was kind of set up and organized, reinforced a relatively wide, shallow interaction. We did a wide range of things, but not necessarily any one so well. I would say to some extent the maritime security cooperation is the one exception, whether it's missile defense in the maritime realm or potentially ASW. Other areas of the maritime realm I think has some of the most potential because it's offshore, it's a little bit out of sight, and it's not territorial, it's not necessarily Japanese forces coming to Korea. So they collaborated in the counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, counter-proliferation as well. But that's why this radar lock-on incident in my mind was so disturbing, because that was something that we actually practiced. This whole idea of search and rescue cooperation was one of the most basic, simple exercises that we always conducted. And the idea that a Japanese aircraft is noticing a South Korean naval vessel dealing with some kind of rescue effort or assistance to a civilian fishing boat, which was a North Korean fishing boat. This is recounting some of what happened in late 2018. And the idea that they could not effectively communicate to say, hey, we're here, what's going on? Oh, this is what's going on. Hey, how can we help? I have eyes in the sky. I can help you see things that you can't necessarily see there on the ocean. We're here to support you. You know, we're in international waters. Instead, it was each side kind of really took a very defensive, non-cooperative approach to the item. So that is something that we're working against. There's another point that was raised in our workshop in Tokyo. A couple of things I wanted to highlight on this issue of structural challenges. One is a counterpart of mine who was a part of the DTTs noted that there were two main drivers of trilateral cooperation. One was geostrategic, essentially the shared threat dynamic, primarily North Korea. And the other was institutional. The alliance relationship with the United States kind of drove each country to, as a favor to us to do things on the trilateral component. And this friend of mine worried a little bit that both sides could be changing or weakening, in the sense that the shared threats were not quite the same. Japan has really moved. Of course, they're still very concerned about North Korean nuclear missiles, but moving toward concern of China, South Korea being more wary of shifting the focus of trilateral cooperation in that direction, and also trying to really reconcile in some ways with North Korea. And the potential, as we have operational control of Korean forces in Korea, this OPCON transition issue, or a changing U.S.-Korean relationship on the peninsula, will the institutional, and some discussion of host nation support arguments, etc., will that institutional relationship with the U.S. alliance be the same as it has been as another driver going forward? I'm going to finish up here so we have a chance to get into some questions and discussion. But in terms of kind of issues to consider going forward, some of these I referenced. How do we build trilateral institutional knowledge amid all this changeover? What is the right balance between frequent interaction and covering different things versus diving into a few key priorities? It was interesting, this was, again, from my slide back in 2012, we really had a heavy focus on if we can just get this GSOMIA, this trilateral information sharing agreement, we'll be able to do so many things, that somehow that was holding us back. That's true to some extent, but this is there have been complaints, for example, in Korea about our military information sharing agreement with Japan. It means nothing because they won't share all their radar data from the radar lock-on incident. And of course, the Koreans won't share what they have with the Japanese either. So they'll share information about North Korean missile locations and things, but there's still a deep lack of trust going forward. Although in 2017, when the North Korean threat was very big, it was actually quite good. In my mind, the sustainability of trilateral security cooperation, I think, is really going to be determined by the value that it delivers, and the perception by the public of the utility and appropriateness of trilateral cooperation. I think the value that it delivers, the military value that it delivers to each country, ideally is the most important. And that would drive you towards a focus on, of course, countering North Korean threats, being prepared for crises related to North Korea, cooperative threat reduction, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear issues, and a variety of things. But the public won't really see that. And to some extent, I think you also want to shape some of our security cooperation in a way that the public can look at it, see, and recognize and say, yes, that's good, that's natural, that's normal, we should do that. And that could be disaster relief oriented. It could be regional commons oriented, whether it's dealing with fisheries or covering illegal fishing and the like. So a little bit of both the hard military value and the visible benefit, I think, is useful. That gets to, there was one other comment that this friend of mine made in the workshop related to this, and I'm trying to think of the exact point. So it was, all right. Oh, I've lost that particular point in my mind, but it's in the workshop report. It just doesn't have his name associated with that. But I've already spoken for quite a long time, so I think I'll stop on this note and open it up for broader dialogue.
I have a microphone. If you please wait and.
Oh, well, actually I was signaling to you to make sure the mic was available, but since I have the mic, well, first a quick comment, then a question, Jim. The quick comment is, wow, so literally the Daniel Morgan Carnegie endeavor with the Korea Diplomatic Academy and the JIA in Tokyo is the sole trilateral mechanism ongoing now among the three countries outside the government.
That I know of on a regular, that is scheduled for a multi-year basis. At this point.
A regular. That's kind of inspiring and deeply disappointing and troubling, isn't it? It sort of reflects the nature of the way things are going. Do you feel that the situation where we're facing a deterioration in South Korean-Japanese relations is promoted by, on the one hand, domestic considerations that aren't really foreign policy, security policy related in South Korea, and a general sense of Korea fatigue in Tokyo, where certainly, in January, my own visit revealed a lot of people saying, we try very hard and it just gets worse and worse, so we can even do better negotiating with Russia, apparently. Do you feel that that helps describe the dynamic, or are there other elements that are more important?
No, that's a good question, and the way I often think of it, or the image that comes to my mind, is something of a wall that has various holes in it that have been kind of papered over So you can't, from a distance, you can't see that there are all these structural holes in them. And I think over the course of the 90s and parts of the 2000s, there were efforts to kind of cover these holes. But at other various times, politically, holes have been poked in them, where the exposure is, whether it's the comfort women issue, whether it's related to forced labor issues, whether it's textbooks or other things. In both countries, on the Korean side, I think, have essentially been renegotiating on their own, unilaterally, the 1965 treaty. That they were unhappy, the current government especially, is unhappy with the way certain things were settled at that point. And Japan, some in Japan, have been renegotiating the apologies that were made, whether it's the Kono statement or other types of gestures that were made in the past. And so people now can see, from a distance even, you can see, look at this wall with all these holes in it. And as anyone knows, repairing these kinds of things are much more difficult. First of all, because anybody who walks into that room now, even if you paper over it again, you know that hole's still there. And it's also just harder to repair the same hole multiple times without it beginning to show and demonstrate. So there's I think that's a major limiting factor. It's just simply the politics of the situation. So we're treading water right now on the security cooperation side. I talk to friends of mine and they say, we're continuing our dialogue, but we don't want to talk about it too much, and we can't do that much in terms of being ambitious. But I think there's still a lot of value in holding or keeping things ready to go in case, I remember the point that was raised that I wanted to bring up before, which was a friend's recommendation that there are times when you sometimes put when the situation allows itself, you put in structural components into the trilateral security cooperation that you may not actually be able to take advantage of. But later on, when the situation calls for it, it's there and you can call on it. So the information sharing piece, and the question arose, did Japan push too quickly or too hard to formalize the GSOMIA with Korea? Because some of the US were saying, when the Japanese came to us and said, we really want to push and work with, now that we had this agreement with the PAC government on the Comfort Women Agreement, and it opened up some opportunities to move on this GSOMIA, we want to pull the trigger on that. And military information sharing is kind of disappeared right now as a result of the problems, but that agreement is still there. And so maybe later, if North Korea gets more belligerent, or if there are other issues in the region where it becomes important, they can call on that and go back to that. So some of this is kind of keeping the capability to do this all together and looking for strategic ways to improve our kind of structural institutional ability to do that. But I have no good, quick solutions on some of those issues. And as a participant yourself, you remember the challenges we faced, whether it was, could we all three have a public event together in Tokyo on this issue? What was the title of the group going to be called, and various things. We got into all these. Once we got into the meeting and we didn't have any press involved or anything like that, we had a very constructive dialogue. We didn't agree on everything. Arms control, I think, is going to be a really important trilateral dialogue going forward, with the U.S. pulling out of the INF and other issues related to nuclear development in China and North Korea, et cetera. How does the China dynamic, technology, economic trade issues are all areas now that you could add to this wide trilateralism component, where I think all of us see value in leveraging our cooperation as a core group in broader networks, but it's going to be hard to do that in an aggressive or more public way.
Dave Maxwell, Foundation for Defense Democracies. Thank you, Jim. That's a great presentation, and I can really look forward to reading your report, because you really put the history in great context there, so I can tell the report's going to be very valuable, so thank you for doing that. Had some flashbacks to the TCOG in the 90s, and one of the contingencies we were working on together was, of course, North Korean collapse, regime collapse. that was one of the sensitive areas. But my question for you is, and hopefully it's in your report, but in regards to the armistice in Korea and subsequent changing to some kind of peace regime, and the impact that the armistice going away might have on 7 UN bases in Japan, and the impact on security and for the war plans in Korea. Are you addressing that in your report? And if so, how are you looking at that potential problem if the armistice goes away?
Yeah, there's a little bit of it in there, and I'll characterize our report as really a report of the discussion that took place in January. But the broader project kind of going for it, that was to help us sort out what are the issues we need to talk about and where do we stand now and how do we structure the rest of the project. But I think we're going to have actually some focus papers that come out of this initiative in advance of the next meeting, for example, and then from that in the next meeting where we'd actually have a trilateral take on some of these issues and sort through some of that. And so U.S. forces in Korea and the future of U.S. forces in Korea was a big topic of discussion. Some of that is covered in the report. The issue of operational command relationships was another topic. So as you have OPCON transition, as you have growing Japanese capability, legal and functional, to be active in the region and in a potential Korean contingency, does the U.S. need a stronger command component in U.S. forces Japan, as opposed to just somebody that looks after the base relationships? Should there be a regional U.S. command dynamic? What's the relationship between Japan and PACOM, Indo-PACOM in that regard? So there was some discussion in there, and that's in the report, but I think that's an area for further discussion. The Japanese, one of the Japanese I remember had this great line of, because the threats are so existential now from North Korea, even though it's less acute in some ways than it was in 2017, you still have growing nuclear missile arsenals in North Korea, and Japan is, within X minutes, could potentially suffer a major nuclear attack. Many in Japan want more visibility into U.S. South Korea planning for various contingencies. They want to be closer to the CFC on some of these things. And they call it taxation without representation, in the sense that all these bases in Japan, U.S. bases and UN flag bases are part of this fight, but we don't really get any say or any even real visibility into what's going on. Ironically, so the Japanese kind of want a more integrated command in a sense. On the peninsula, we're going away from that, not necessarily away from that, but so that's an issue to discuss going forward. I think the U.S. South Korean view generally was, well, rather than jump into the CFC component, have like Japanese liaison officers in this CFC, we don't think that's going to happen either, whether that's necessary or. But if you get into issues of evacuations of non-combatants, NEO during a crisis, we need to do more collectively on that for sure. But why not use the UN flag, the UN cap, as the vehicle by which Japan becomes more involved in peninsula issues? So it could be ascending state, or it could be, because it has those bases, that there's a legitimate connection for Japan to be a part of that. So I think that's in a sense of where the value of the UN piece is. And I know at least General Brooks in Korea had been really promoting the internationalization of the UN presence in Korea as a valuable piece in this regard, his naming of the deputy commander from Canada. So I think there's maybe some potential there.
Is there a question here?
Hey, I'm Caitlin Campbell with the Congressional Research Service. Thank you. This was really interesting. I get the sense that amid the sort of erosion recently of the trilateral, BMD has kind of been preserved as a sustained priority. I think if I'm getting the math right, we will have had 3 trilateral BMD exercises in 2019, 2018, 2017. I don't know what it was like before that, but is your sense that the level of cooperation on BMD among the trilateral is sufficient for our needs right now? Is it kind of keeping pace, even though these other elements have sort of fallen back? And then, to what extent, if at all, did the sort of the three no's thing with China after THAAD sort of impact the trilateral work on BMD or anything else,
Yeah.
to your sense?
No, that's a good question. So my short answer is that yes, I think the BMD has been one of the best examples of preserving this trilateral security cooperation component because of that perceived shared value and the whole thing. But that it's not necessarily sufficient, or certainly not far along as it could be. So my understanding is that the history of those trilateral BMD exercises actually go back to 2012. I think the first Pacific Dragon exercise was then. Now, it was very primitive or simple, and information was being shared, U.S. Korea, U.S. Japan, and the U.S. played that kind of node in the middle. And then that was part of the reason why we were pushing so hard on the information sharing agreement, because the thought was that, at least at a technical level, allows you to do that. So my understanding is, we have the technical capability right now because of the interoperability of all three of our Aegis systems. All three could see a common operating picture leveraging all of the sensors of all of their ships in any given moment. So we have the situation, I think, when one of the missiles that was launched by North Korea, I forget what year, exactly which one, but it was noticed first by a South Korean asset, and that information came to the U.S. The U.S. then had to pass that on to Japan, and there was a bit of a lag or a delay in that process, and there was some criticism, I think, in Japan that why did we not know this was about to fly over Japan until this much later. We're still not at a situation, I think that the politics has held back full implementation of full visibility and smooth sharing of information at all times. But I think in the exercises, especially the ones most recently now, they've begun testing that to some extent. So I don't know exactly at what level, but the potential is there to kind of seamlessly do this, and but I think there's still a desire by both Japan and Korea to make sure they have some control over how much gets shared. So there is a way to do this, and it's the air traffic control model, which is, we have a global air traffic control system. Each system is all controlled by their own country. We don't control the air traffic controllers in France or whatever, but we all see and share that information. And if for some reason you want to turn off your system access to the other nations, you can do that. You have that sovereignty. But we don't do that because we all benefit from that information. So I think there are ways to progress, maybe not in contradiction to an explicit commitment by a South Korean president that we will not do this, but there are ways to collaborate in this field without giving up your sovereignty or without permanently putting yourself into some kind of trilateral alliance. So in some ways, the framing of it, the way we frame it is really important. I think people and the media often think, oh, this is a trilateral missile defense system. And it's not. It's a linkage of independent sovereign systems.
I think we have time for one more question. Brief question.
Hello, my name is Kenneth Otto. I'm a graduate student here at Dana Morgan in the Intelligence Course Program. And my question to you is, how do you approach this conversation from an economic lens, an economic or business-related lens, in terms of trilateral cooperation between the Republic of Korea, Japan, and the U.S., and to what degree does is that impacted by China's economic growth, the Belt and Road Initiative? You know, in the South China Sea, about 30% of global trade enters those waters. Basically, how do you approach these concerns from an economic lens?
Yeah, well, there are kind of differing pressures or aspects to that. You know, at one level, for example, the economic component to the piracy issue that's going on and off the coast of Somalia and the Gulf of Aden was a driver to collaborate in the security field in this realm because we had a shared economic interest in that area. When you get closer to home, more purely economic trade focus, especially when you get the China component in there, there's more some of the zero-sum thinking where it actually becomes more difficult, I think, to collaborate trilaterally because some Japanese and Korean companies view themselves as fierce competitors, and if they're somehow gaining, then I'm somehow losing in that dynamic. So that's hard, although it all depends on what you want to talk about. And I think this issue of, you know, we see it now with the 5G, Huawei, other issues of standards or cybersecurity, or what are the rules of the road for some of the future technologies on governing AI, bioethics. You know, you had the situation in China of a experiment on gene editing with you know, human embryos or future children, and those are areas that this gets to the common values piece, I think, and the common economic system that we have a shared interest in kind of certain rules or certain standards and certain ways of accountability or access. The whole data protection, information, data localization, information security dynamic is another area, I think, where we could pursue more trilateral cooperation, as well as countering fake news and you know, dealing with issues related to disinformation campaigns, you know, nation-sponsored disinformation campaigns. Part of the problem, though, now is it's kind of hard, I think, politically in South Korea to proactively recommend a trilateral answer to that. And so, in that case, I think the trilateral piece is less overt, and we're a caucus within a G20 or the OECD, or where we're all members, for example. And the G20 is one of the better examples of, we want similar high standards on infrastructure investment vis-a-vis the Belt and Road in Southeast Asia. We want certain basic things on regional commons, on trade and economic issues. And so maybe that's a trilateral conversation that's kept out of the limelight per se, but it adds, together with Australia, together with the EU, or together with others, creates a real critical mass to move things in a direction that we all have shared interests on that front.
Well, please join me in thanking James Schoff of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And please look for our event on Monday. We have a member of the Japanese Parliament who will be here to talk about cyber resiliency. So we've had this tremendous series of events on Asian political economy and security issues. And this today was our latest installment, and we have another one coming up on Monday. Thank you.
Terrific. No, thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
Terrific, and then we'll have more,
Good question.
Hi.
coming in the future.
Have you a card?
I'm afraid I do.
Yeah.
Nice question.
You always come up with great questions.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
That's not.
Nice to meet you.
Just gotta give me the visa sounds better. I will send you a note.
Yeah.
Welcome to our events.
Thank you so much, I really appreciate it.
So, here, hi,
Me and then just-
Yeah, well,
Slack, I ask questions like that. You know, not that savvy when it comes to expertise, but I always think about what the economic.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of overlaps. That was a big part of our discussion, especially in the China context of where the future of China could have some more real ideas considering the economic security.
Yes, it will. Actual written report.
Yeah, right, and there's copies of that out there. It's not, it's a little different, doesn't have all the background that I went into, but it's more just a description of the discussion that you had. It's okay, where we're trying to focus on.
So I'll take a look at this, read it, and I'll follow some of what you're seeing.
Thank you.
Dave, no way.
Yes, yeah.
New card.
U.S Japan
Oh, great.
Alliance reports.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And time
Give us some readings.
Really.
It's like overlaying.
Thanks, yeah, I've also been providing access.
Yeah, I've known them for a while.
Yeah, they're wonderful.
When I have, especially younger scholars. Get them exposed to it. So I feel great welcome.
Jinx, there's a wrong
They're
words right now.
fantastic, and
Yeah.
they're very happy to do my job.
Excuse me.
So it's good. Thank you again, really appreciate it.
Good.
Nice meeting you.
Hi.
I'm from Korea.
Oh. Pleasure to meet you.
Very nice to meet you. At last. I had several friends in Carnegie. So usually,
I'm trying to make sure I didn't give away any secrets.
I work, ate, and drank with Kobe and
Oh, terrific. Yeah, to get you over to the
Yeah.
Asia program, to get away from the nuclear.
Exactly. So it was really helpful, very interesting. And actually, we didn't know you've been working with Korean diplomat.
That's right. Well, Kim Jong-wook is our main
Oh.
counterpart, and they're actually coming to Washington, I guess, sometime soon.
Yes.
May 1st.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right.
I think, yeah. So I have to give them copies of the report.
Yeah.
And so we wrote it ourselves. This is, and we make clear that this is not a consensus document.
But you know, the various ideas and the question you raised is really great. So I think it will be a very good trigger to activate diverse discussion of this. The trilateral cooperation is necessary.
Yes.
It's really helpful for all of us. The problem is how to, as you said, how to make it more appealing and
Yeah.
acceptable to the public.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's cool. And
Great.
then your point about the rotation of people thing, that is really, inspiring,
I think
the frequent.
It's a challenge.
Yeah.
But that's why the track 1.5 piece sometimes can be a
Yeah.
help, because the track 2 people
Exactly.
are all the same. We don't go anywhere.
Yeah,
They were saying they know some other projects that are going on as on.
Oh, okay.
There should be
Oh,
some
well, I should
other,
include those and update those.
yeah, there should be some other trilateral done in track 2. There might be some in 1.5. 5. If you could find anything and if we can share with you, we'll share.
Oh, that'd be great. Well, I'd like to keep updating this, and we'll be planning our next trilateral for here in the fall.
Mhm.
So now that this report is done, we'll be doing a lot of dialogue with IFAN's KNDA and with Jaya in Tokyo to get the agenda set for that and maybe do some background research in advance of that.
You may actually be in one of the meetings for KNDA.
Great. Well, and then, of course, the embassies are always involved. You'll see in the report, we had people from the Korean embassy in Tokyo, people from the U.S. embassy in Tokyo. So the embassies are always involved in these events in addition to others.
Excellent.
Great to meet you.
Stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Did I give you one of my card?
Actually, I organize events, so perhaps you can speak, or you know someone who'd like to speak on this or some other issue that's important to you know.
Well, we'll take on it. Thank you.
Great, very nice to meet you.
Take care.
Hi, I'm Paul Lee.
Yes.
Oh, right,
It's a junior fellow.
right. So, I have a question for you. I thought about historical memory. This was a German historical memory.
That's the
Issue
key
that-
issue.
I mean,
Without
it's
doubt.
a current, it's not just a memory, it's a feeling, it's shared.
Right. And it's in the education system, it's in pop culture, it's in political discourse, it's in, now the general, if you get to, Japanese businessmen, Korean businessmen got together on a project, that works out fine. Koreans still make up the largest portion of visitors to Japan every year, and Koreans love there are reasons why, where those narratives don't necessarily emerge, but at a political level, it's been extremely difficult to get over what is in many ways, and we were talking about this actually, you look at President Moon's March 1st speech, which was the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the original government in 1919.
Well, Jim, I'm going to leave you for 2 minutes.
Okay.
I'll be back while you talk with your wife.
Okay. Jim Schoff, yeah, we met before.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Thanks for coming,
My
guys.
pleasure. Thanks for, anyway, this was very interesting because the provisional government was established in the context of colonial Korea by, Imperial Japan. And in that speech, he talked about the need to kind of eradicate or separate the collaborators, or the history of collaboration with the Japanese, vestiges of collaboration with the Japanese, in service of supporting Korean nationalism. So he connected, and Paul and I are trying to work out how we articulate this, but the whole movement toward anti-communism, anti-North Korea, kind of the difficulties that the South encounters in trying to reunite Korea is the flip side of the coin of those collaborators with Japan and by extension later the United States in branding the North Koreans as the others, as the enemy. And so there's this Korean nationalism flip side of the coin of anti-Japanese sentiment that it's hard to promote unity in Korea without utilizing that history of the colonial period. And so I'm thinking of what are the ways that you can try to have Korean nationalism without it being having anti-Japanese component.
Let me ask you, if I were to organize a conference, either a single lecture or perhaps a panel discussion or wider conference on the issue of this issue of historical memory, why this, because of history,
would this be helpful, or would this not be helpful? Will this tend to inflame things, or will this be?
I mean, it's a good case study, I don't,
But
there's no.
people need to understand the context.
Yeah,
I mean, Americans have trouble understanding, well, you know, what's the problem in Northern Ireland? I don't understand Catholic Protestant.
Yeah. Oh, Turks
What's the
and
big
Greeks
deal?
and
But it is not, it is still an issue.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this is, I mean, from an adaptive point of view as an academic institution, but I don't know if this would be
I
something
think
that
if you approach it from an academic perspective, you're not necessarily trying to referee or
get into
solve,
advocacy or take sides.
but understand how that plays a role. I mean, we did a conference at Carnegie a while back in collaboration with Jaya, looking at the U.S. Japan reconciliation as a potential, not a model, but as one example of reconciliation for strategic purposes. And this is always what's hardest for us to understand is we understand, both leaders in Japan and Korea recognize that true reconciliation between the two of them would be in their national interest, long-term strategy. You know what I mean? So how do you promote, if you know you want to get there someday, what actions can you take today that help you get to that point? To me, that's separate from the specific issue of whatever is going on. And Kimobuchi Summit 20 years ago was trying to lay that out. They had this whole roadmap of how they were going to improve relations between Japan and Korea. And we did a separate conference then on what happened at the Kimobuchi Summit 20 years later, and look at the report card that's really gotten there. So it's always a delicate issue to address, but I think if you address it as this is a phenomenon of international relations, and it's an inhibitor of peaceful and stable relations. That's a worthwhile topic among other examples.
Because I think people going into it, whatever their level, not understanding the context, will make come across as being very insensitive.
Yeah,
A lot of people have seen that in other contexts, not this, but other, where people, just Americans will just spout something that, I don't know, it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Really, if you understand the history, people tend to appreciate
Yeah.
What happened.
Well, and that's where we're going in the wrong direction, unfortunately, in the Korea-Japan case, because both cases now, they're pulling out of their curriculum that had been put in earlier, where at least they taught the views of the other side. So they still promoted their own view, but they said, and this is how the Japanese view it, or this is how the Koreans view it. It was not too long ago, the Japanese Ministry of Education said, we're no longer going to teach the Korean view of Fukushima ownership. It's just going to be our view. And how does that help? In terms of, at least understand that somebody else has a different view. But thanks for the opportunity.
That's very interesting.
Just keep us posted.
Yes.
You decide to pursue.
Absolutely. Because we'd like to.
Dave
we'd like to
Maxwell
follow up,
was
I
in
think,
Seoul when
some
I was in
continuity,
Okinawa.
so-
Oh, really?
And, yeah, he
Like we've
a
done a lot
friend of
of
mine shared
research.
an office together, and then Dave came over to Okinawa. He was with
Yeah.
first
Not just on security, but
Economics.
history. It's all.
It's
He
history.
and I crossed paths often
Some
over the
people
last
have current
20
events,
years.
but
Especially
to
Man,
finance that, you have to.
I was in Korea off and on quite a bit, 99 to 2002, when I lived in Okinawa. And then when I was at Marfort Pack, we would go to Korea often. And
They have
the question back
advertising.
then was on the whole alcohol issue, and in what direction should
Yeah.
we
It's
go?
not,
And,
Oh, yeah, they had a huge
In
protest.
fact,
outside British Embassy yesterday.
He just
Who
now
did that?
retired, was their rock commandant, General Lee. He was my counterpart. He was a colonel at the time. And my boss from Afghanistan just retired. He was a 3F
You have to
commander.
figure out how to get behind it. but
So he would see
you have to
General
know
Lee,
it.
see all these other guys, and he goes back and forth frequently to
You're working on that.
Korea
Yes.
because
And you're a senior.
some of these issues are so
Well, that's not
sensitive.
me. I mean,
Sometimes I'll ask the retired U.S. officers
No,
when
what
they
do
come
you
and say,
favor?
what do you think about this issue?
When,
And that way they can hear a lot of different
Yeah,
viewpoints
yeah.
as they
Show them back
deliberate
to my
on
office.
path ahead. There's an American by the name of Ned Forney who writes a column in Soul. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
No, I haven't.
But his grandfather was the chief of staff, I think, at 10th Corps. So when they wrote all the thousands of North Korean refugees out of Chosin, his grandfather was here.
Oh, wow.
So he writes a lot in a local blog in Korea, but it's also the English language. So he's reached out to me a couple of times. We collaborated on a couple of things. But President Moon's parents came from up there.
Yeah.
And they were part of that boat lift that came out, all the refugees that came out and resettled in South Korea. And you look at that, and you look at nationalism, which we're talking about, which also look at Pak Sun-yup, look at Park Chung-hee, or the Kwantung Army, the Japanese in Manchuria. And Park Chung-hee took a different approach. It was more patterned on what he learned in the Imperial Japanese Army, more along the lines of Saibatsu and Japan and industrialists. So you have these two competing views in society that a lot of people have been imbued with. So what's healthy is there's a lot of political parties and a lot of voices in South Korea now, a lot of the younger generation. My sister-in-law was from Seoul. And so the younger generation have a much different view, I think, than the folks that lived through Park Chung-hee and a lot of other regimes.
Well, that's interesting, because I mean, my connection with Korea is less, I work on Korea, I was mostly a Japan guy, I've lived there, speak the language, I don't have that same experience in Korea, so I don't necessarily feel as in touch sometimes with what's going on there.
Well, I worked for Joe Gregson many different times.
Oh, yeah,
And
he was my boss at OSB.
He was just awesome. I mean, he has such rich background and understanding of a lot of different places in Asia. And so I served under him in Okinawa.
Oh, terrific.
And then he pulled me to Hawaii, and then he retired right after I got
That's great. Well, let me make sure I give you my card, because I remember we tried to get you, I think, over to Tokyo.
Yeah.
But we weren't able to make that, but our next workshop is going to be here in Washington, so in the fall, so we can definitely get you.
Well, I'll tell you, I went down and did some work in Quantico for a while with Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, and I just gave that up.
Okay.
And I'll be back here teaching part-time probably this summer. And there's the day in the morning too. But, yeah, thanks. But, no, thanks for coming today. It was very important, great talk, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, yeah, there's a lot more to come. We're going to keep working on this a little bit. Hopefully, my partners in Korea and Japan won't be pissed off with what we said.
That's fine.
Because I told them we were doing this, they said, okay, no problem, but I never showed them. But I think they'll.
It's good. It's good.
Great.
Professor Sinkin wanted me to take you back to his office.
Oh, okay.
So, if you could follow me.
Sure. Okay, you don't have to do this.
Did you want to come? Yes, it's Hopkins 1789, sealed down. No, I'm sorry, sealed down. One second. Thank
But there was a Chinese, if you want to sit down, there was a Chinese, I'm actually on leave today, but I think.
Oh, well,
But, there was a Chinese community in Cuba.
yes.
But they, most of them left, because they just, they won't want to stay. Not all of them. No, they came to try to come to the U.S.
Oh, that's interesting.
They didn't
Yeah,
want to
there
live
was an
in-
event, I lived near Chinatown. They had an oral history event with the Chinese Cubans.
Oh, really?
Now resettled, a couple months ago, last fall.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Yeah,
Who sponsored it? Yes, actually, sure.
I think it gave you mine.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I did. Yeah, so my undergraduate degree is actually in Spanish,
Oh.
and my graduate degree is in national security, which is really a separate discipline. I guess it's combines international relations. Whereas, of course, without area studies, you're not really
Need both.
functional.
I spent a long time studying Spanish as well.
Oh, did you? Oh, really? You went to Spain? I still would like to go in to study. I didn't get to do that when I was in college, so I missed out. So once I have the money and I have the time, I'm going to go. And I'm going to do my semester for a year.
So the only hard,
I'm not like, I haven't given that up. This is still
right, some people want to get out of school as soon as possible, never come back. People like you and me, want to go back to school.
But that's interesting, you're showing. So Evan Ellis looks a lot at. Well, that's interesting, you have more than one regional area.
Well, this is called it first year.
Of course, like Peru, South America, was Japanese immigration. Brazil, yes.
President of Peru was Germany.
Yes. So,
Anything
the Fujimori was in Japanese. I don't know what happened.
we got a scandal, right? With his daughter and
Right.
yeah. Sorry, where are you from, Miami?
No, I grew up in Massachusetts.
Oh. I was there last week for the Boston Marathon.
Oh, really? Did you run it? Oh, I would love to start running again. As you can tell, I'm far from, I'm not there yet.
Running, studying spinning.
I'll start running again soon, this week.
Yeah.
I couldn't run like marathon. I used to do a lot of 2 mile run. So in the Army, they had us,
Oh, you were young?
yeah, so the PT test was always a 2 mile run. Or push-ups, sit-ups, and 2 mile run. So I kind of was used to the 2
How
miles.
many, is there like a time?
There were time limits. I think it was,
Push-up?
there were push-ups minimum and maximums within a certain time. Or you could max it out over a certain, over a certain time. I think for the 2 mile run,
We have to do it at
no, we could do it without, because we're running here.
okay, that's good.
The 2 mile run, I think the limit was 18 minutes. But I think you could max it out at 13 minutes. The best I did was 12 something.
That's really good. Yeah.
12:06, 12:10. So that was not bad. So I wasn't an athlete, but I was in good shape.
Yeah.
I wasn't carrying the weight.
Army, but she was shaking.
Yes. So I kind of like I was kind of used to always training for the 2 mile run. So like in college, in my 30s, before like in my 40, like I would always run 2 miles. I always measure that.
Yeah, well, there's the 5K, which is US popular, that's just another mile.
Right, that'd be like 3. So I could
Well, I could definitely do that.
the 10 mile would be kind of pushing it. But the 5K is very popular. So you rate.
Sorry.
Yes, I'll go in.
About you, like, whoever does the IT stuff.
Oh, the IT, yes.
Yeah, because you got the answer, so
Right.
you want to make sure you have all this.
Yes. Yeah, we will.
All right,
Sure. You always ask.
too.
Yeah, you could if you asked him.
Okay.
Because I don't want to touch his IT
Yeah,
stuff.
well, that's right. I don't do that either.
So you ran the Boston Marathon, so how was that?
It's like a holy grail of running. It's like a mecca. The oldest marathon in the country.
Is it the oldest? I grew up in Boston. I think the subway in Boston was built 1898, maybe?
Oh, really?
It's one of the oldest.
Yeah,
Right. I think it may be older than the one in New York.
it looks pretty old.
But
Definitely older than DC.
did you grow up around here? or-
Yeah, I grew up, well, I was born in South Korea, but I grew up outside New York City.
Oh, okay.
New Jersey.
Oh, okay. Oh, so you've been in South Korea? So you do speak Korean?
I do.
Were you able to study at the college level?
I just grew up speaking of my family. I studied, not Spanish, I studied Chinese and Japanese.
Oh,
That's what I do now. Chinese, Japanese.
well, it's good if you have the language from your family, because you just know the language. You can understand it in a sense, the structure. So if you want to study it or add vocabulary, you're not trying to figure out the grammar.
Yeah.
Like with English, you learn it by listening.
Alright. Our language, I'm teaching an English and second language class at this local church.
Oh, really?
And, yeah, it just reminds me how hard language is. There's so many exceptions and
Yes.
non-logical rules.
You know, when I had to study, there was a trend back in the late 60s, I guess, to study phonics. And it's the phonetic system. And I could speak English. And even if I could correctly write sentences and didn't make mistakes, they wanted me to learn phonetic with phonics. And I found it very confusing because there's more exceptions. What phonetic system is, you just have to know the words. Because it's sort of developed out of German, but then we have the French phonics. Yeah, English was Germanic, Anglo-Saxon. So, but then because of the Roman conquest in 1066, French were introduced.
Yeah.
So, so we've been discussing many issues from the Boston Marathon, second language acquisition.
Yeah, it's all cover up. Yeah, I'm gonna give you those if any students are interested. I love having them there. So, I made the mistake visiting Yes.
That's kind of aggressive.
Robert Hershey was the engineer, who's done a lot of work. Very successful. Very cool.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just, I gotta go, that's gotta go soon. I'm gonna try and talk to them.
Yeah, so Frank, all of those, just, events, you have, you could look them up and watch them, or you can.
Most of them are recorded and they want to wait till the work is done.
Okay.
Yeah, the guy just said no.
Well, that's important. Those are all my questions.